This is the lecture for Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste. So first topic, length. So this reading is longer than I think anything else in the class. So um, apologies. Number one, notice the actual reading stops at like page 30 something. The rest is the end notes. So it's not quite as long as it looks. And number two, uh, it's an important reading. It's an important, one of the famous works of political philosophy. So uh, you can take some extra time to read it. And maybe you've read it before, maybe you've read it before multiple times, so that will help it go faster. Number two, it helps to know, so you'll notice it's written as a speech, and it's not a speech he ended up giving, and so it helps to know the context behind that, but I'm mostly not going to lecture on it because number one, the endnotes sort of explain it somewhat, and number two, it's very simple. So you get the context of the intended speech right in the first sentence. So he tells you who he's going to give the speech to, and then as you read, once you get to section, I forgot what, I think section 15, section maybe 14, 15, something. Like once you get to that part, you will realize why they did not want him to give this speech. So it's pretty straightforward sort of why this ended up not happening. Number three, like I mentioned, there are lots of endnotes. They're very, very good endnotes. If you see just an endnote after something you don't understand, I highly recommend reading the endnote. At the same time, there's a lot of endnotes, and some of the context they give you might not need. I don't know. I mean, my recommendation is read all of them, because why not? But look, if you don't have time, whatever. But they're good. They're good notes. Uh, so from now on, everything in the lecture, if you want, you can watch, you can stop watching, go read, and come back after you've done the reading. But if you want, you can keep listening to the lecture. You might find it helpful to listen first. You might find it helpful to listen after you've done the reading. It depends. So first, number 4, 5, and 6 on the lecture outline. I'm just going to sort of point out some things in the reading that link to earlier readings in case you find it interesting or helpful to sort of draw uh, links between these things. So first, social and political power. So if you recall from the Nancy Fraser reading in the identity politics section, there's this sort of debate over, what kind of power matters in society, and can there be sort of economic power that is divorced from social power and sort of economic problems that we cannot fix merely by fixing social problems? And then also vice versa, are there any social problems that we cannot fix just by economic stuff? And so we had we can imagine the two polar opposite options are the redistributionists and the culturalists who think everything will be solved if we sort out the culture, and the redistributionists who say everything will be solved if we sort out the economics. We can imagine the sort of strictest redistributionist would be something like the Marxists, who say, look, if we get communism established, this will sort out all the other problems you might have had with society. And so we get some thoughts on this topic about sort of how social power is in some places and for some reasons divided from economic power, such that they're sort of not the same thing and not reducible to each other. And so we have in 3.1, 3.6, he's kind of explicitly arguing against the socialists on this point. So it's clear he doesn't agree with the socialists. And then it's worth thinking about how does he fit into the dichotomy we saw between Fraser and Young and maybe Perec also. Sort of where would we fit Ambedkar into that? Second, so in section 11, he's talking about why he thinks caste makes Sangathan impossible, and two things to mention. Just first, in case you don't have the historical context here, he's referring to a particular movement. Maybe this is very obvious to you. Maybe everybody learns this sort of Indian history stuff growing up. I don't know. I have no conception of what sort of history you know. If you don't know what he's talking about, footnote 74 was helpful. The bigger point to make here is just the kind of concerns that were underlying the movement, or the sort of things they were trying to establish, like what they were hoping to inculcate, is very similar in a lot of ways to the sort of thing Taylor talked about, the sort of patriotic fellow feeling that he thought was necessary in order for a society to work. And so it's worth thinking about what does Ambedkar have to say about like the impossibility of this, and how does that fit in with the sorts of things Taylor was talking about. Next. In 14.2, we get a bit of discussion of what he thinks about democracy. He says, democracy is not merely a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. It's essentially an attitude of respect and reverence toward fellow men. So as you'll notice if you read the notes, Ambedkar gets a lot of stuff from Dewey. And Dewey was also a big influence on Anderson. Like you saw Anderson cite Dewey in a few places when she was talking about her conception of democracy. And so it's worth thinking about, like we don't get a well, I was about to say we don't get a lot. We actually do get a pretty good amount of what Ambedkar thinks democracy and democratic society should look like. You will recall some of the debate, you may or may not recall, some of the debate between Arneson and Anderson was how much political democracy do we need in order to sort of have a like democratic kind of society? Arneson said, you know, it's kind of an open question, and maybe we can get democratic society without democratic politics. And then Anderson and Ambedkar, it looks like, are saying it's a mistake to divide these two things. Democratic society is sort of part of democracy, like completely considered. Like democracy is not merely a form of government. It's also about how people relate to each other. So when we talk about democracy, we're not talking about how the government is run merely. We're also talking about other things. So that's a debate we've seen a bit of, and we see Ambedkar wading in to the debate. So that's sort of just some links between this reading and earlier readings. Next, so we just finished the identity politics section, and it's worth thinking where exactly does Ambedkar fit into that debate? Like who among Young and Fraser and Parekh, sort of who would he most align with, or how does he feel about the arguments that they gave? And there's certainly like some anti-identity politics sorts of things that he says, and we're going to get to that in the next part of the lecture, the objectivity part. But then there's also some sort of like pro-identity politics sort of things that he says. So for instance, that thing about social and political power that I mentioned up above in section 4, he's going after the socialists, the Marxists, who think just fix the economy and everything else will work. He thinks, no, clearly we also need to fix the culture in certain circumstances in order to eliminate injustice. And the idea that we must sort of fix the culture in certain ways, that's already getting us a little close, or maybe very close, I don't know, but it's at least a little close to what Young and other defenders of identity politics want to say, which is that this is not merely an economic problem, there are also social problems. Now, of course, identity politics goes a bit, maybe not a bit, goes beyond that and says it's got a prescription about how to remedy the social problems. And part of that has to do with approaching things in terms of group identities and understanding group identities as being politically relevant in certain ways that demand recognition. And so it's worth thinking about where Ambedkar would fall on that dichotomy too, or on that, like how he would think about that question. And I don't think there's like an easy obvious right answer here, but it's, you know, there's a lot to talk about in the annihilation of caste unit in the course, but one of the things to talk about is to what extent any of this is a continuation of the identity politics unit. Like, is this like to what extent do the concerns we raised there still remain here? And if they still remain, like how do they remain? Like how do they apply? Next, objectivity. So in a lot of the previous lectures, this point has been coming up, and I just want to point it out here. Throughout the reading, and the first example we'll look at is here in 14.1. So he says, I will therefore turn to the constructive side of the problem. What is your ideal society if you do not want caste is a question that is bound to be asked of you. If you ask me, my ideal would be a society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. And why not? And so this is a proposal about what society should look like, and he gives arguments for fraternity and arguments for liberty and arguments for equality, and that's, I don't know, sounds to me like a pretty sort of objective kind of approach to this sort of thing. He's saying, here is what society ought to be like. We ought to have liberty, equality, and fraternity. And if you don't like that, I think you are wrong. And here are the reasons that you are wrong. So maybe we sort of here have a pretty straightforward approach to justice. Notice liberty, equality, and fraternity are, broadly speaking, what we got from Rawls. The first principle of justice is equal basic liberties for everybody. So that's liberty and equality. And then the second principle of justice is about equality of opportunity, and then the difference principle. And so there you get equality again. And then Rawls thought, like you may recall from the Rawls readings, that he thought the way his principles of justice worked and the way they were arrived at, we also end up getting fraternity out of them. So we've seen liberty, equality, and fraternity, at least in Rawls, and maybe in other people we've read, but most clearly in Rawls so far. So that's some thoughts about sort of where does Ambedkar stand on like how to understand justice and how to understand politics, and what is his answer. And then following on that, and also partially switching to a new topic, he talks about division of labor here in 4.1 and 4.5. So there are two ways to look at division of labor, which also match up with, like, he says there's division of labor the way caste gets us division of labor, and then there's division of labor the way sort of the capitalist understanding of division of labor. And so these, like the way I have them broken down here on the outline is sort of capitalism and justice. So we're going to start with the second one, not the caste division of labor, but like the normal sort. So this is a very famous idea. You've probably heard it before, but if not, it's most famously associated with Adam Smith, who we've seen pop up in this course a few times. Amartya Sen cited Smith a lot, and he's popped up a few other times too. So basically Smith's big point, not his one big point, but one of Smith's big points is that you can have massive increases in productivity with division of labor. People do what they are good at, and then they sell the stuff that they make, or they sell their skills at making things to other people, and then it all sorts of it mixes together much better than if everybody were trying to do everything themselves. And this is supposed to be one of the chief benefits of capitalism. Capitalism really harnesses the division of labor in a way that no other system can. That at least is the argument, not the argument again. That is one sort of argument for capitalism. And you'll notice as Ambedkar talks about many of the benefits he talks about for the division of labor in the capitalistic sense are sort of like capitalist benefit, like, efficiency benefits and stuff. So not directly moral benefits, but like, you might be interested in them because they seem like they're benefits in some sense, like we get more stuff. And so that's just to point out that this is a preview of some stuff that will come up a little bit when we talk about capitalism, which is our last unit. So just to sort of get you thinking about these things, because of course Ambedkar is clearly thinking about these things. And then second, he's fine with the capitalist division of labor. He's obviously very not fine with the caste division of labor. And the reasons, it's worth thinking about the reasons that he gives for not being okay with the caste division of labor, because some of those reasons are related to like the benefits of capitalism. Like some of the things he says are caste division of labor does not get you what capitalism division of labor gets you, and so it's bad for those reasons. Some of the things he says are more directly, are sort of just directly about justice. Like forget capitalism specifically. Just think about justice broadly, and the way caste works gets you a division of labor that is very unjust. And so this brings us back to point number 8, the previous one about objectivity. He has views about how society ought to be run and what is just and unjust, and he thinks caste quite obviously trespasses on these sorts of views. And so it's just worth thinking about, like, of course the objection, like, of course this piece is against caste, but the sorts of arguments he's drawing on to oppose caste are, like, it's worth comparing those to the sorts of arguments we've seen about like what justice must look like and stuff from Rawls and Nozick and Sin and people like this. So that's it.